G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and a fantastic week. Now legends, thank you for all of the well wishes of those who know I'm going through my round of chemotherapy this week. Now it's day 3, but I've only had 2 doses so far, and realistically I'm feeling all right. But we need to take into account this does attack my brain. So I really do struggle on memory and word recall. So if I do miss a few days or I miss a few things, I apologise in advance. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. We're going to look at some strikes in the very beginning, some aircraft and some FAB glide bombs. We'll be looking at the maps, comparing maps, looking at some geolocations that show different to the maps. We need to talk about Putin's Victory Day ceasefire. He has suggested a 3-day, 72-hour ceasefire from the 8th to the 10th. Of course, 9th of May being Victory Day. We need to look at why he's doing this. We need to look at Ukraine's response to this, as well as some of the diplomacy around that, the ceasefires, peace treaties, because it's very different where Ukraine and Russia are sitting. Ukraine, they want a pause. They want a ceasefire. They want it unconditional. Russia, they want an end to the war, but they want a peace treaty. They want conditions on it and a line in the sand. So we'll look at why both sides are going in those directions. It's not done for nothing. It is done because of diplomacy, political theatre, and everything that evolves around war. And we will, in the beginning as well, talk about Russia's conditions. Sergei Lavrov, of course, Russia's foreign minister, he has spoken with a Brazilian media outlet, and he has laid out very clearly Russia's conditions for ending the war. Last week, we saw the European-Ukrainian peace framework to end the war. We also saw the American, and the American was, they said, final offer. We know both of those are unacceptable. We know the American framework was unacceptable to Ukraine, and we said it's probably unacceptable to Russia as well, because as much as everyone thinks it is, we still believe it's not as much as Russia want. As well as the Ukrainian-European framework, well, that relies on either massive military actions or a complete failure somewhere in the Russian system. That is very based on ideals and fairies and myths and legends at this point in time if you actually look at the state of the war. But again, we will see, and we're going to go over all of it. Let's start with the strikes. Now, I'm sure you have seen this footage at time of posting. Now, what this shows, or allegedly shows, is a Ukrainian Su-27 fighter aircraft going down, said to be in the Sumy Oblast. Now, importantly, the pilot, he has been recovered by friendly forces and is said to be in a stable condition, probably 1.5 inches shorter, being punched out the roof of an aircraft. But there's a little bit of speculation about what shot this down. Some are saying it was friendly fire air defense, and others are saying it was an S-400 system from Kursk. On that, we don't know. Realistically, unless it is self-confirmed, we won't ever know. But we always say our threshold with aircraft is very, very high. On this channel, we actually require footage of the damaged or destroyed aircrafts, not just claims. Remember that claim the other day around the Tu-22 that was blown up? That went silent awful quickly. Whether it's F-16s, TUs, Sus, MiGs, whatever, we require a large threshold because they're a very important piece of equipment. But we do know that has gone down there. Now, the FABs, Russia's glide bombs. We do know over wintertime they were hit very, very hard with Ukrainian electronic warfare. And then we saw a lull in them being used because they weren't as effective, they weren't as accurate, although they still have a degree of accuracy because ultimately these still are a gravity weapon. They are a glide bomb at the end of the day. But we have seen with new antennas that their accuracy has increased. And I'm going to show you today a good example of this, and of course tactically important because it's taking down bridges. Now we need to come down into then the Rozliv front line, and we're in this sector in here. This is just to the south of Pokrovsk, and then I'll show you my slide made up. I prepared this one earlier, pull it out of the oven, and it is this bridge here and this bridge here, both at small intersections across then a waterway to the west of Oleksivkia. And what we see by this footage is where these bridges are and the accuracy in the improvement of these fabs. These fabs in the beginning were more of an area weapon into a tree line, into a village, into the front, where now they are really, by this footage, showing pinpoint accuracy on multiple hits. You can see on this footage 4 of them striking, which would make sense as the Su-34 can carry 4x500 FABs, and all 4 striking right on this relatively very, very small target. If you are 30 kilometers away looking at a bridge, it is very small. And this gives us an idea of the increased accuracy of these, therefore having to reduce using your incredibly expensive munitions to hit something like this. This is a very important update on the front. Those new antennas, we will see Ukrainian electronic warfare start to impact that more. This is the cycle of warfare. Their offensive weapons increase in capability, then they decrease with defensive capability, and it's that just tangle all the time. So that is our strikes. We'll move on to the maps in a sec, but I want to talk about these conditions. And Lavrov, he has laid this out incredibly clearly. And of course, we know Ukraine cannot accept these conditions, but let's go over them. The question was asked from Brazilian media, what terms would Russia agree to come to the negotiation table with Ukraine at this point? And he talks about previous negotiations which have failed with, as he says, the request of Western curators. And he goes over all of it in here, as well as security guarantees for Russia. And I've just pulled out dot points of this. So if you want to read through this, it's on the Telegram, and I guess you could screenshot right now. But I've pulled out just this in dot point form of what he says. That 1, Ukraine must cancel the law banning negotiations with Russia. Now, I can't believe that Trump and Vance, Rubio, all these aren't pushing more on that, because for Ukraine to say we want an end to the war but still holding a law that makes it illegal to have any negotiations with the other party, I can't believe there isn't more pressure for that to be lifted. Maybe behind closed doors there is. Now, Ukraine must abandon joining NATO and reaffirm a neutral, non-aligned status. Ukraine must dismantle what Russia calls the neo-Nazi regime, or as they are looking, the post-2014 government. Ukraine must stop eradicating Russian language, media, culture, traditions, and Orthodox faith. Ukraine must recognise Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zap as part of Russia. Now, remember, the American framework said that Crimea would become de jure, so it would become Russia. These other areas would become de facto, but along the border where if it was to freeze at this point in time. And we said, basically, well, Russia already have de facto control of that. I don't see why, because you need to dangle a carrot at this point in time. But that would be recognised, including the areas of which Russia does not occupy at this point in time. Any Ukrainian commitments must be legally binding, enforceable, and permanent. So not a ceasefire and we'll look at it. No, it's legally bound in a treaty. Ukraine must be demilitarized and denazified. Sanctions against Russia must be lifted. Lawsuits and arrest warrants against Russian figures must be withdrawn. The most notable here is against President Putin. Frozen Russian assets in the West must be returned. Russia must receive solid security guarantees against NATO, EU, and their member states near its borders. Now, this is a very maximalist view of this war and their demands. But what we have said is, well, this is where likely Russia's demands are. Now we have it really spelt out for us. And what I'll say is, between the three frameworks we have, if we call this one of the frameworks, the US one is far closer to this than it is to the Ukrainian European one. So it will likely settle somewhere, if it does settle by diplomacy, which I think is unlikely given just the gap here, somewhere in between that. But we'll go over more of this and how Lavrov is playing a lot of politics here. The question was asked, what do you think about the role and actions by the European Union and the US in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict at the current stage? He says the European Union has been sticking with its policy to offer all-round support to the Kyiv regime. Brussels does not want anything but Moscow's unconditional defeat. Any other outcome would amount to losing the geopolitical game for it. The EU believes that by ending its support to Ukraine, it would demonstrate its strategic incompetence and impotence. In other words, the bureaucrats in Brussels focus on saving their reputation rather than achieving a fair and lasting peace. Basically saying here that the bureaucrats in Brussels will throw Ukraine under the bus to save their own reputation. Instead of facilitating a settlement, the EU has been seeking to undermine agreements by arguing that there has been little, if any, effort to invite it to contribute to these talks. At the same time, the EU is preparing to send military units from NATO countries to Ukraine despite all our warnings that would be unacceptable. Arms deliveries to Kyiv are continuing. The EU also plans to ramp up defence manufacturing. They are all creating all of these coalitions of the willing and discussing ways of creating extra budgetary mechanisms for procuring more weapons for Kyiv. Against this backdrop, the fact that the current administration in the US is trying to understand the root causes of the crisis is quite encouraging and contrasts with the Biden administration, which pumped the Kyiv regime full of lethal weapons and was proactive in its efforts to draw Ukraine into NATO. President Donald Trump has said many times that there would be no conflict if the preceding administration did not seek to drag Ukraine into NATO. Moscow and Washington maintain a dialogue to find a path towards a settlement. We hope that this paves the way for mutually acceptable results. And there is a lot in this. And this is textbook, realpolitik, informational warfare, which is very typical of Mr. Sergei Lavrov. And he is, love him or hate him, among the most experienced foreign ministers in the world today, if not the most experienced foreign minister. And this is a point of concern which I've raised many times, is if you get Lavrov and Rubio in a room together, I don't have that much faith in Rubio's ability to outmaneuver someone like Lavrov and how they see their world orders or where things are going. But this sort of diplomacy that we see in this does work on traditional realists like Trump, far better than with progressive idealists in Brussels. Now, there's a few parts in this that we need to go into because there's a lot more meant by the words than just reading the words. Lavrov suggests the EU is just emotionally invested, reputationally desperate, and acting irrationally, choosing to save face over lasting peace. And going into that idea of, well, to the last Ukrainian, as long as we can save face. Does it, or is it, giving weapons to save Ukraine, or because it's anti-Russia? Now, driving a wedge, he separates the EU and the US in his answer here, suggesting that the current US administration, that they're open to understanding Russia's concerns, unlike the Biden administration or Brussels, then pulling those two further apart, driving a wedge between them. He's softening Russia's stance and image, presenting Russia as reasonable, open to dialogue, and portraying NATO and the EU as the aggressors, escalating further militarization. And he's playing into Trump here because he's placing blame on the previous US administration. He says this multiple times in this. He's appealing directly to Trump's public statements like, this is Biden's war, it's Obama's war, it's not mine, it would never have started, etc., while simultaneously praising Trump's approach as more understanding and pragmatic, not being driven by ideology or emotion. See the point here for the EU and idealistic actions, as well as what we see in the European and Ukrainian peace framework. So a lot of sort of realpolitik, no ideology, emotionally charged in here being played, and that will play into, and he is trying to play into Trump and drive that wedge between where this administration is, how they don't see themselves responsible for this war, that it was the previous one, and driving a wedge between themselves and the European states as well. Now, J.D. Vance, he has then said this. He's warned, while he can't say with 100% certainty that peace will be achieved in negotiations, he was certain that if it doesn't stop, the Ukrainians aren't winning the war. I think there's this weird idea among the mainstream media that this thing goes on for just another few years, the Russians will collapse, the Ukrainians will take their territory back, and everything will go back to the way it was before. That is not the reality we live in. And you can see what I'm trying to show you is where Lavrov, what he's saying, what he's suggesting, what he's presenting, and where the US administration is sitting and how it's playing into that. Vance also predicted that continued fighting would leave Russia and Ukraine grappling with a demographic nightmare. Absolutely it would. If Russia walk away with occupied territories, which is highly likely given where the US framework is, that will buffer Russia more because there are millions of people there, and hit Ukraine even more hard because, of course, it will lose people in those areas, and people who have fled Ukraine will, on a lot, not return due to the war not ending at all on favourable terms. And he says, and risk escalating into nuclear war. If the EU had the way of which Lavrov suggests of wanting a complete collapse of Russia, and as Vance says with the mainstream media, that is a big risk that like America would be looking at is if there is a complete collapse and the existence of the state is at risk, and no, Kursk never threatened the existence of the state, what would that actually look like? And I've said before that this seems to be a bit of the, we'll give Ukraine enough weapons to defend themselves, but never enough to win because we're scared of what if that then happens. Vance and Rubio, they have both suggested they could wash their hands with this conflict, but we haven't seen a deadline for that. Of course, we hear a lot about deadlines, but can the US or will the US just walk away? At this point in time, we really don't know. So let's have a look on the maps. And after we've just spoken about some of those occupied territories, can it become Russia? Will it become de facto? Whatever in this. Let's have a look at then some of the percentages that are occupied. And AMK mapping, he has then this. And we showed war mappers, but let's go over AMKs. The Crimea is 100% Russian controlled. Luhansk is 99.3, so close enough. Zap is 73, Donetsk 70, Kherson 69, Kharkiv 5, and others in here. But again, we don't hear about Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, or Sumy. It's these 5 we hear about right here. And what I'm suggesting in this and showing you is that Russia does hold the majority of these. And the total of Ukraine, including Crimea, of occupied is 18.8%. And Trump, being the very realist that he is, he will be looking at those numbers if he really is wanting an end to the war. And again, I think it is likely we will see the US walk away because where Europe and Ukraine is sitting, where Russia is sitting, it's just so far apart. So, of course, here's Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, there's no red check on this map today, no blue check. So, Deep State is saying that there are no confirmed movements, except for one, but it's not presented in red or blue check because it doesn't want to show it, is around Demidovka. Now, this is where Ukraine crossed into Belgorod. Surak suggested yesterday, the day before, that this area has come back under control of the Russian forces, and we see from there to then there today. Now, realistically, I don't think Ukraine's going to hold on to this. A lot of this Kursk area has been pushed back. Russia's saying all of it. And at the end of the day, I believe Ukraine's crossing to Belgorod was to tie up Russian forces in here in order to try and pull out as many Ukrainian forces as possible from Kursk. So I don't think there's going to be too much effort really on holding this, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this collapse back across the border as just to the north of here does also. So let's have a look up around Kursk from Suryak maps. Now, where we're coming is then into Gornal, and Gornal is this small area that sits just in here. During the last 48 hours, Russian army took full control of the locality of Gornal and adjacent forests, reaching the border with Ukraine in this axis. So what we can take out of this is Ukraine still hold areas in Kursk, but they don't hold any towns or settlements in Kursk. But as far as area, they definitely still do. And there's footage to also back this up. Now, while we're on the Deep State map, I wanted to talk about this at some point because we see a lot of this, and I believe this is very, very dangerous. And Deep State have shared this. On April 28th, the 14th Grenadier Division, Galicia, was created, and we'll not forget the shooter with the golden lion on its sleeve, and a bit of a homage to these guys. The thing that is missed in this, and purposefully missed, is 14th Grenadier Division. What you're missing is that they were Waffen SS. These were Nazis. This is 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. And we see a lot of this. And this is just revisionism, history, bullshit. Nazis as well committed many atrocities against the Ukrainian people. So did the Soviets. Millions, hundreds of thousands died needlessly there. But this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, therefore forgiving that and glorifying this from the Canadian Parliament to things like this, I think is disgusting. And I've said optics for Ukraine are incredibly important. Ukraine need Western support. They need to keep that flowing in. And I cannot believe Zelensky hasn't gripped this up, himself being Jewish, even just for the optics of how this looks into Europe and the atrocities the Nazis did and how everyone fought back against this. I cannot believe Zelensky won't sign like an executive order and just say anyone with any Nazi shit is in trouble, just to end that, because you could just end that bit of propaganda right there. That tells us about that some of this is a lot more deep-seated than people would like to admit. It's not as deep-seated as the Russians would like, but to act like it's not there too. Well, it is. And this area of the world is incredibly, incredibly complex. Okay? So I just want to say that because I think optically too, that is very dangerous. And just this revisionist way of seeing history that a lot of people are doing, very dangerous too. And I guarantee we're going to see this on May 9th, massively. So let's come back down into then the Pokrovsk eastern area, Tatasivkia front line here. And I'll just bring up these Syriac maps, and he's suggesting that more area between then this intersection and this Novopoltavka, that it's getting filled in here. Wait out for further confirmation of this. And then we're going to move into the northeast of the country. I've got a couple of geolocations to show you here. So we're looking for Kamyanka. Now, I've got two geolocations in order because as I was getting them, I thought, oh shit, there's actually another one. So we see Syriac map here suggesting Kamyanka. A lot of Kamyanka has come under control. That the Ukrainian army is still present in the northern dashes, but the majority has come under control of the Russian forces. And what we can tell by this is we can confirm this by these geolocations. So we see the first one just here. It's just in this sector, right sort of on the right, just behind where the green is here. And then what we will do is show you the footage of this. Again, take me just a second to find it. It's later on in the video. We see a Russian flag on that building there, confirming that movement. And then a few hours later, we get then this confirmation. So in the northern part of Kamyanka, I believe further than Syriac is showing, up in this sector, there's a road that doglegs out to the west. It's just to the east of that. We then see this footage here. Again, give me a second to find it. It's about 2 minutes 20. We see then a Russian flag go up on a building in here, as this one, here too. Same one as before. So we see two flags going up there, suggesting a lot of Kamyanka has come under control. Not yet shown on this map. Again, wait out and see if it does get shown. Then we'll come down Kupiansk, Yahidny, Kislivkia front line. And we do have the second update for the northeast from Syriac. And he is suggesting, see where this sort of doglegs up and around, that this area in here has come under control by the Russian forces and Ukrainian movement out of this Stepova Novoselivskia. But again, we will see and confirm if this is correct. We will see movement of around 3 kilometers. It tends to be movement of around 3 kilometers a day. Let's have a look at this to, where was I? I want to come sort of up into this dogleg in here, and this is about 1.4 kilometers. But that is very important. Don't take away that this northern movement, I think small movements up there are more important than a lot of more large movements further down. Now, ceasefire. Ceasefire has been suggested, and we see this decision of the President of Russia. This was on the Kremlin website. The Russian side declares a ceasefire for the 80th anniversary of the victory. Of course, the victory against the Nazis. Putin says for humanitarian reasons during the days of the 80th anniversary of victory from midnight 7th, 8th until midnight on May 10, 11th. The Russian side declares ceasefire. All military actions are suspended. Russia believes the Ukrainian side should follow this example. In case of ceasefire violations by the Ukrainian side, the Russian armed forces will provide an adequate and effective response. The Russian side once again declares its readiness for peace negotiations without preconditions. Again, like I said in the beginning, Russia wants to talk peace negotiation treaties, not ceasefires, and then move forward, aimed at eliminating the root cause of the Ukrainian crisis and constructive interaction with international partners. We'll talk about why Russia and Ukraine are on those separate sides there. We in Ukraine never wanted a single second of this war. Back on March 11, we responded positively to the American proposal for a full ceasefire. We made our own proposal to Russia bilateral to halt strikes on civilian targets. We also proposed making Easter ceasefire full and extending for 30 days. That 24 hours or 30 hours we saw, Zelensky wanted to extend that. Strikes again, these was long-range strikes against then a lot of targets we have seen. And realistically, I don't think Ukraine and Russia can either really uphold that they were to the line of that. Also, it needed to be cleared what is a civilian target and what isn't. And this line's very blurry in full-scale war, because if there are soldiers in an apartment block and that gets hit, that is not a civilian target. If there is electricity flowing out that is helping the military do this, it's also not a civilian target. Same as if a Ukrainian drone flies into an area providing fuel to Russia, not a civilian target. The line gets very blurry, or people make it blurry when it doesn't fit their narrative. Russia has consistently rejected everything and continues to manipulate the world, trying to deceive the US, and yet again another attempt by it manipulation. For some reason, everyone is supposed to wait until May 8 before ceasing fire, just to provide Putin with science for his parade, trying to deceive them, manipulation, but at the end of the day, this is diplomacy at work. We value human lives, not parades, referring to Putin just wants a ceasefire so no one's dying on that day. But there has been some horrible parades take place where a lot of people have died. He's saying that only will return to the killing afterward, and it must be immediate, full, and unconditional. Yes, Zelensky wants an unconditional because that benefits him way more than Russia. He's not wrong in wanting that, but it's the reason Russia won't agree to it. We affirm the proposal. The American side also remains on the table. Russia knows exactly what it needs to do and how to respond to a genuine ceasefire. Now, Caroline Leavitt, a massive upgrade to the White House, the press secretary, has said to reporters that Trump was increasingly frustrated with Putin and Zelensky, and both they need to come to the negotiating table to end the war. Is there a line in the sand when Trump will walk away? I don't know, but I think if there is, we're getting closer and closer to it, and that benefits Putin massively. You need to remember that both Zelensky and Putin and the other teams, they're all playing politics in here. And I believe Trump's team, they know that this ceasefire was never going to get signed off by the Russian forces or by the Kremlin. But they say, well, this gives Ukraine a card and a tool to say, well, they are not willing to come to a ceasefire. It gives a political tool. Now, there is major concern that I see among Russian pages over some level of attack on the May 9 parade, whether it be drones or more of a association with a terror device, say a VBID, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, just an IED, hide shooters style, somewhat like terror-style attack on the Victory Day parade. There is huge concern over that. If you're amassing that many forces, whether it is a conventional attack or more of a hybrid attack, yeah, there has to be a huge concern. But what I would say is this would be suicide for further US support, although US support has become more fleeting, so it may be less of a concern. But I do believe there will be a lot more political theatre around this than actually security related. It's just going to be too high of cost. But again, we will see. But we'll definitely see this used and politicised, and I hate that about any military memorial. I hate when it is politicised. It'll be politicised by Russia, it'll be politicised by other nations, when really a lot of people should see to the lives laid down in defeat of the Nazis. And also, we had a Memorial Day just the other day, which ended up getting then politicised. But in that too, it spoke nothing of the then Russian Soviet sacrifice in the same battle of defeating Nazis as well, which is all focused on the West. It had nothing to do with the East. And I'm saying, look, we should be like, look, let's not use this for politics. Let's talk about what actually happened and what actually had to come together to defeat that incredibly deadly and catastrophic regime. Now, Zelensky, he will have to accept this ceasefire proposal from Putin. And what Putin's proposal is doing for him is it's showing the US that he's willing to engage in peace, but it must be on his term, as we see, wanting to address the root causes. But I can't see that Zelensky can reject this proposal, because that would look really bad towards the US. Both Russia and Ukraine's unconditional offers, they are conditional in their very nature, because there's a very clear difference that Ukraine wants a freeze, not a peace treaty, and Russia wants a peace treaty, not a freeze. Now, Ukraine, they want a freeze to put Ukraine in a stronger position, because freezing military actions while economic sanctions against Russia still hold, it will put Ukraine potentially in a stronger position than where they are right now. Russia's the opposite of that. Military actions is where their main leverage is. Russia, they want a treaty signed given the nature of the battlefield on this present moment. Without a freeze that could then increase Ukraine's position, they want to lock in their battlefield gains. This is why Russia wants a treaty, Ukraine wants a freeze. Ukraine doesn't want a treaty, or else they would lift the law against negotiating with Russia. They want a treaty after a long ceasefire that they can be rearmed and get into a more powerful position. Remember, again and again, like a choir, the European states will say, Ukraine must negotiate from a position of power. This freeze that Zelensky wants, this ceasefire, this is in an attempt to get them into a position of power to negotiate. This isn't a negotiation. It's a step in diplomatic actions to try and get into a position where they are at least more powerful at the table. And Putin doesn't want that. He wants to be able to go, no, we want the nature of the battlefield right now, or its deteriorating nature, to lock in our gains and impose our requests. Now, what was proposed by the US framework, Putin already has this. This is where I see this really falling apart. Putin already de facto controls the 4 oblasts along the front line, at least along the borderline, where a freeze would take place. And aside from Google Maps, Russia does basically de jure control Crimea. Why do I say this? Well, Putin knows any military attempt to retake Crimea would be Pyrrhic. It would be unbelievably difficult. Even whatever is delivered beside nuclear weapons, it's going to likely be a Pyrrhic victory. And if there was some plan in the works, I believe the US would be vehemently against it, knowing the costs that it would take and also the threat of nuclear weapons as far as how important that specific area is to Russia and their assets there too. And Zelensky, he's made it very clear that there will be no territorial concessions and no abandonment of his ambitions for NATO membership or at some level of de facto NATO alignment. And his primary backers in Europe, they support this stance. And he knows the only way to achieve this is through military actions in that, quote, position of power. And the ceasefire is part of this. The ceasefire that is proposed by Zelensky is just a pause to give him the chance to regroup and rearm. And this is exactly why it is labelled unconditional and exactly why the law against negotiations isn't being lifted. This is a pause. It's not then to sign treaties within that period of time. So I believe this war will continue on and likely deteriorate further. I have a podcast coming with someone who you'll really like talking specifically about this. Now, legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.